In the vast emptiness of the American frontier, where words were scarce as water in drought season, every spoken promise carried the weight of a man's soul. Some folks forgot what they said as soon as the wind carried their words away. But Sarah Beth Morrison remembered everything, every whispered confession under starlit skies, every vow made beside crackling campfires, every tender word that fell from the lips of the man who rode away one September morning and never came back. Until now. Sarah Beth Morrison stood at her kitchen window, flour-dusted hands pressed against the cool glass, watching the dust cloud rise from the horizon like smoke from a distant fire. Her heart hammered against her ribs with the same rhythm it had kept 23 years ago when she first saw that particular way of riding, loose in the saddle, confident, like a man who belonged to the land itself rather than any town or territory. The morning sun painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the valley where her small ranch nestled between rolling hills. She had built this life with her own hands after he left, board by board, fence post by fence post, season by season. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and coffee, the same smells that had filled her childhood home back in Missouri before the war changed everything. But, now, as the rider drew closer, Sarah Beth felt the carefully constructed walls of her new life trembling like leaves in a storm wind. She knew that silhouette, knew the way his shoulders sat square and strong, knew how he held the reins with just his left hand while his right rested easy on his thigh. 23 years had passed, but some things carved themselves so deep into a person's memory that time couldn't touch them. "Mama, who's that coming up the road?" Her daughter Emma's voice broke through her thoughts like a stone through still water. At 19, Emma had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, though she didn't know the truth about either parent. Sarah Beth had told her that her father died in a mining accident when she was just a baby, and Emma had never questioned the story. Just a traveler, most likely, Sarah Beth managed, though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. Probably looking for directions or a meal. Emma moved to stand beside her mother at the window, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been helping with the morning chores, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs before the heat of the day set in. He rides like he knows where he's going, though. Not like someone who's lost. Sarah Beth closed her eyes for a moment, remembering another morning when Emma was just learning to walk, how she had stood at this same window hoping to see that familiar figure riding up the valley. She had given up hope long ago, or thought she had. Hope was a dangerous thing for a woman alone on the frontier. It could make you soft when you needed to be hard, make you wait when you needed to move forward. The rider was close enough now that she could see his face beneath the shadow of his hat brim. Matthew Donovan looked older, lines carved deeper around his eyes by sun and wind and whatever roads he had traveled since that September morning in 1869. His hair, once black as midnight, now showed threads of silver at the temples. But his eyes, when they met hers across the distance, were the same piercing blue that had haunted her dreams for more than 2 decades. "I remember you said you'd never leave me," she whispered to the glass, her breath fogging the surface. "You said I was the only woman you'd ever love, that you'd rather die than spend a day without me. You said you'd build me a house with a view of the mountains and fill it with children and laughter." Every word came back to her as clear as if he had spoken them yesterday. She remembered the night he had proposed, down by the creek behind her father's house, how the moonlight turned the water to liquid silver and made his eyes shine like stars. She remembered how he had taken her hands in his and promised her forever, how his voice had shaken with emotion when he slipped her grandmother's ring onto her finger. "You said we'd grow old together," she continued, her voice barely audible. "You said you'd love me until the day you died and, beyond, that not even death could separate us." Emma was still watching the approaching rider with curiosity, but Sarah Beth saw recognition dawning in her daughter's eyes. There was something familiar about the way the man sat his horse, something that stirred memories Emma couldn't quite place. "Mama, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, she had. Matthew Donovan had been dead to her for 23 years, buried not in any graveyard but in the deepest corners of her heart where she kept all the things too painful to examine in the light of day. She had mourned him as surely as if she had seen his body lowered into the ground, had worn black in her heart if not on her dress, had learned to sleep alone in a bed that felt too big and too cold. The sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed dirt of her yard brought her back to the present. Matthew had reached her gate, was dismounting with the same fluid grace she remembered, was tying his horse to her fence post as if he had every right to be there. As if 23 years hadn't passed. As if he hadn't ridden away and left her with nothing but promises and memories. She watched him walk toward her front door, noting how he favored his left leg slightly, how his face had been weathered by years under the open sky. There was a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before, and his clothes, though clean and well cared for, bore the marks of long travel. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to watch his surroundings, who had seen enough of the world to know that danger could come from any direction. When he knocked on her door, the sound echoed through the small house like gunshots. Sarah Beth's hands shook as she untied her apron, as she smoothed her hair back from her face, as she tried to compose herself for a conversation she had imagined 1,000 times but never thought would actually happen. "Should I answer it, Mama?" Emma asked, but Sarah Beth shook her head. "No, child. This is something I need to do myself." She walked to the door on unsteady legs, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. Through the small window in the door, she could see Matthew's face clearly now. The years had changed him, marked him with experiences she could only guess at, but underneath the weathering and the scars, he was still the man who had promised her forever. When she opened the door, they stood looking at each other across the threshold, across the years, across the gulf of pain and abandonment that lay between them. Up close, she could see the crow's feet around his eyes, the deeper lines around his mouth, the way his shoulders carried the weight of whatever he had done, whatever he had seen, wherever he had been. "Sarah Beth," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, deep and warm like honey poured over gravel. You look beautiful." She wanted to slam the door in his face. She wanted to rage at him, to demand to know where he had been, why he had left, how he could stand there after 23 years and speak to her as if nothing had changed. But she also wanted to throw herself into his arms, to feel safe and loved and complete for the first time in more than 2 decades. Instead, she stood frozen, drinking in the sight of him, cataloging every change the years had wrought while her heart raced and her mind spun with questions she didn't know how to ask. "You remember me," she said finally, and immediately felt foolish for the words. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, sad and wry and full of pain. "Sarah Beth, I've never forgotten a single day with you. Not a single moment. Not a single word you ever spoke to me." "But you left anyway," she whispered. His smile faded, and she saw something break behind his eyes, some careful control slipping away to reveal the raw pain underneath. "I had to. You have to believe me, Sarah Beth. I had to leave." "No," she said, stepping back from the door. "No, you didn't have to do anything. You chose to leave. You chose to break your promises. You chose to abandon me. Sarah Beth, please. Let me explain." But before she could answer, Emma appeared behind her mother, curiosity overcoming caution. When Matthew saw her, his face went white as bleached bone. His eyes moved from Emma's face to Sarah Beth's and back again, taking in the resemblance that couldn't be denied, understanding dawning in his expression like sunrise over the mountains. "Dear God," he breathed. "Sarah Beth, is she?" "Emma, go tend to the chickens," Sarah Beth said quickly, but her daughter was staring at Matthew with the same intensity he was showing her. "You're my father," Emma said, and it wasn't a question. "You're the man who died in the mining accident." Matthew's hands clenched at his sides, and Sarah Beth saw tears gathering in his eyes. "I never died, Emma. I just wasn't there." The pain in his voice was so raw, so immediate, that Sarah Beth felt her own carefully maintained anger wavering. This wasn't the reunion she had imagined during those long, lonely nights when Emma was teething and she was exhausted and overwhelmed and so desperately in need of help that she had wanted to scream at the empty sky. "Why?" Emma asked, and the single word carried the weight of 19 years of questions. "Why weren't you there?" Matthew looked at Sarah Beth, and in his eyes she saw a plea for understanding, for forgiveness, for permission to explain what couldn't be explained. But she also saw something else, something that made her blood run cold. Fear. Not the kind of fear a man felt when facing a wild animal or a dangerous stranger, but the deep, soul-crushing fear of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him and was terrified of losing it again. "There were men looking for me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dangerous men. Men who would have hurt you both to get to me. I thought if I left, if I stayed away, you'd be safe. What men? Sarah Beth demanded. What did you do, Matthew? He closed his eyes, and, when he opened them again, she saw the weight of 23 years of guilt and regret. I killed a man, Sarah Beth. The night before I left. I killed him, and his brothers swore they'd hunt me down. They swore they'd make me pay by hurting everyone I loved. The words hit her like a physical blow. All these years, she had imagined him choosing freedom over responsibility, adventure over love, the open road over the constraints of marriage and fatherhood. She had never imagined him leaving to protect her. You should have told me, she whispered. You should have given me the choice. What choice? His voice was bitter now, full of pain. The choice to watch you die? The choice to see our child grow up with a target on her back? The choice to live every day wondering if today would be the day they found us? Emma was looking back and forth between her parents, trying to understand the conversation that was reshaping everything she thought she knew about her life. But they didn't find you, she said. You could have come back. Why didn't you come back? Matthew's shoulders sagged as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. Because I was a coward, he said simply. Because the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to imagine coming back. Because I told myself you were better off without me, and, after a while, I almost believed it. Sarah Beth felt tears burning her eyes, tears she had refused to shed for 23 years. All the anger, all the hurt, all the carefully constructed resentment she had built up was crumbling like a dam giving way to flood waters. But, underneath it all was the love she had never been able to kill, the love that had survived abandonment and heartbreak and years of lonely nights. I waited for you, she said, and her voice broke on the words. I waited, and you never came. I know, he said, and the pain in his voice matched her own. God help me, I know. They stood there in the doorway, the three of them, held in a moment that felt suspended between past and present, between what was lost and what might still be saved. Around them, the morning sun continued its climb toward noon, birds sang in the cottonwood trees by the creek, and the wind whispered through the grass like voices from a long ago time when the world was simpler and love seemed like enough to conquer any obstacle. But Sarah Beth knew that some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. Some words, once spoken, could never be taken back. Some choices, once made, cast shadows that stretched across decades. The question now was whether love could survive the weight of so much pain, whether forgiveness was possible after so much loss, whether a family torn apart by fear and good intentions could ever find its way back together. Matthew took a step closer to the threshold, and Sarah Beth saw hope flickering in his eyes like candlelight in a storm. Sarah Beth, he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. I know I have no right to ask, but can you ever forgive me? She looked at him, this man who had been the love of her life and the source of her greatest pain, the stranger who wore the face of her deepest memories. She looked at Emma, their daughter, who deserved to know her father even if it meant opening old wounds. She looked at the life she had built from the ashes of her broken dreams, solid and safe and lonely. And, in that moment, standing between her past and her future, Sarah Beth Morrison began to understand that some stories don't end when we think they do. Sometimes they just pause, waiting for the right moment to begin again. The silence stretched between them like the vast Wyoming sky, heavy with unspoken words and 23 years of separation. Sarah Beth found herself memorizing Matthew's face again, the way she had done as a young woman in love, noting how time had carved new stories into his features. The scar along his jaw was white and raised, the kind left by a knife blade. His hands, once smooth from working his father's store, were now calloused and scarred from years of hard labor under harsh suns. Come inside, she heard herself say, though part of her mind screamed against the invitation. Both of you sit down. We have talking to do. Emma's eyes were bright with curiosity and something that might have been hope. She had always wondered about her father, had asked questions that Sarah Beth deflected with carefully crafted stories. Now, faced with the living, breathing reality of him, Emma seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. Matthew stepped across the threshold slowly, as if entering a church or walking on sacred ground. His eyes moved around the small front room, taking in the details of the life Sarah Beth had built without him. The rocking chair by the fireplace where she sat in the evenings, mending clothes or reading by lamplight. The small table where she and Emma shared their meals. The photographs on the mantelpiece, Emma as a baby, Emma starting school, Emma at various ages growing up without her father. "You have a beautiful home," Matthew said, his voice careful and respectful. "It's exactly what you always said you wanted. Simple and clean and full of light." Sarah Beth felt her chest tighten. She remembered those conversations, the dreams they had shared lying in each other's arms beneath the stars. She had wanted a house with big windows and white curtains, a kitchen with a view of the mountains, a garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers. Looking around now, she realized she had built exactly what they had planned together, as if some part of her had never stopped believing he would come home to it. "Sit down," she said again, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "I'll make coffee." Her hands shook as she worked, measuring out the precious coffee beans, heating water on the wood stove. Coffee was expensive, a luxury she allowed herself only on Sundays or special occasions. Having a visitor qualified, she supposed, even if the visitor was the man who had broken her heart and disappeared from her life. Emma helped without being asked, setting out cups and the small pitcher of cream they got from their one milk cow. She kept stealing glances at Matthew, studying his profile, looking for similarities between his features and her own. Sarah Beth saw the exact moment Emma recognized her own nose in his face, her own stubborn chin, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. "I remember you," Emma said suddenly, causing both adults to look at her in surprise. "Not really remember, but I used to have dreams when I was little. About a man with dark hair who would sing to me. Mama always said it was just my imagination, but it was you, wasn't it?" Matthew's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down with unsteady hands. "You were just a baby when I left. Not even walking yet." "But you sang to me," Emma insisted. "I remember the feeling of it, even if I don't remember the words. You had a deep voice, and you'd hold me while Mama cooked dinner. Every night," Matthew whispered, and Sarah Beth saw tears threatening to spill over. "You loved it when I sang Beautiful Dreamer. You'd stop crying the moment I started." Sarah Beth remembered those evenings too, back when they had all lived in the little cabin Matthew had built beside the creek. Emma had been a fussy baby, colicky and difficult to soothe. But Matthew had possessed some magical ability to calm her, walking the floor with her tiny body pressed against his chest while he hummed old songs his own mother had sung to him. "Why that man?" Sarah Beth asked, surprising herself with the question. "The man you killed. Why did you have to kill him?" Matthew stared down into his coffee as if it might hold the answers to questions he'd been asking himself for 23 years. His name was Jacob Cartwright. He and his brothers ran a gang that terrorized folks from here to Colorado. They came into town that night, drunk and mean, looking for trouble. He paused, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to form. They went into Murphy's saloon, started pushing people around, demanding free drinks. Old Murphy was scared, trying to give them whatever they wanted to make them leave. But then, they saw Mary Catherine. Sarah Beth knew Mary Catherine Murphy, old Murphy's daughter. She had been 17 that summer, pretty and innocent and full of life. The kind of girl who drew attention whether she wanted it or not. Jacob took a liking to her, Matthew continued, his voice growing harder. Started pawing at her, making suggestions that made her father go white as paper. Mary Catherine was crying, begging him to leave her alone, but Jacob just laughed. Said he was going to take her upstairs whether she wanted to go or not. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Even at 19, she was innocent enough to be shocked by such cruelty, protected by her mother's careful guidance and the isolation of their ranch from the worst kinds of men. "So you stopped him," Sarah Beth said, beginning to understand. Matthew nodded slowly. "I tried to do it peaceful at first. Offered to buy them all drinks, suggested they might want to move on to the next town where the girls might be more willing. But Jacob took offense to that. Said I was calling him the kind of man who had to pay for what he wanted." He stood up abruptly, moving to the window where he could look out at the peaceful valley beyond.
he came at me with a knife. Big man, bigger than me, and mean as a rattlesnake.
We fought all over that saloon, breaking chairs and tables, blood everywhere. Finally, I got the knife away from him and I put it between his ribs. You were protecting that girl, Emma said fiercely.
You were protecting everyone in that saloon.
That's what I told myself, Matthew replied.
But his brothers didn't see it that way.
They saw their kin dead on the floor and me standing over him with the bloody knife.
They swore they'd hunt me down, make me pay.
But first, they said they'd find everyone I cared about and make them pay too. Sarah Beth closed her eyes, remembering that night. Matthew had come home covered in blood, wild-eyed and shaking. He had told her there had been trouble, that he might need to leave town for a while, but he hadn't told her the whole truth. She had begged him to take her with him, but he had refused, said it was too dangerous. They meant it, Matthew continued. The Cartwright brothers were known for keeping their word when it came to revenge. They burned out families, killed children, did things to women that, well, things no decent person should have to hear about.
So you left to protect us, Sarah Beth said, the anger in her voice warring with understanding.
I told myself I'd come back when it was safe, Matthew said, turning to face her. I thought maybe in a year or two, when things had cooled down, when the Cartwrights had moved on to other concerns.
I never meant for it to be forever.
But it was, Emma pointed out with the brutal honesty of youth. It was forever for us. Matthew flinched as if she had struck him.
I know.
And I know sorry isn't enough, but I am sorry.
More sorry than you could ever know.
Sarah Beth studied his face, looking for lies or excuses or self-serving justifications. Instead, she saw only pain and regret and the kind of weariness that came from carrying guilt for too many years. What happened to the Cartwright brothers, she asked.
Dead, Matthew said simply. All of them.
Tom got himself killed in a gunfight in Denver 3 years after Jacob died. Pete and Morgan died of cholera in Kansas 5 years later. I heard about it from a bounty hunter in Cheyenne, man who'd been tracking them for the army. They were all dead, had been for years, and I was free to come home.
But you didn't, Sarah Beth said, and now the accusation in her voice was unmistakable. Matthew's shoulders sagged.
By then, you'd been living without me for 8 years.
8 years, Sarah Beth.
I figured you'd moved on, found someone else, built a new life. I figured showing up would just cause you more pain.
So you stayed away to spare my feelings?
The bitterness in her voice could have cut glass. I stayed away because I was a coward, Matthew admitted.
Because facing what I'd lost seemed harder than living with the loss.
Because every year that passed made it easier to tell myself you were better off without me. Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, her young face flushed with anger.
But, what about me, she demanded. What about what I needed? Did you ever think about that?
The question hit Matthew like a physical blow. He seemed to crumple, all the strength going out of him at once.
Every day, he whispered. I thought about you every day. Wondered what you looked like, what your voice sounded like, whether you were happy.
I used to imagine conversations we might have, things I would teach you, stories I would tell you.
But you never came, Emma said, tears streaming down her face now.
You never came, and I grew up thinking my father was dead.
Do you know what that was like? Do you know how many times I wished I could talk to you, could ask you questions, could just know what it felt like to have a father?
Sarah Beth felt her own tears starting, 23 years of suppressed grief and anger and loneliness threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. This was why she had never remarried, despite several opportunities. This was why she had kept Matthew's memory alive even while telling Emma he was dead. Some part of her had never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that someday he would walk back into their lives. I know I can't make up for the years, Matthew said, his voice breaking. I know I can't give you back your childhood or give Sarah Beth back the help and support she needed. But I'm here now, and if you'll let me, I want to try to be the man I should have been all along. It's not that simple, Sarah Beth said, though her heart was aching with the desire to forgive him, to let him back into their lives as if the years of separation had never happened.
You can't just walk back in and expect everything to be the way it was. I don't expect that, Matthew said quickly. I know too much has changed. I know I have to earn your trust again, both of you. But, Sarah Beth, I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day in 23 years. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with history and pain and desperate hope. Sarah Beth felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling, felt the love she had tried so hard to bury rising up in her chest like floodwater. You said you'd never leave me, she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her. You promised me forever. And I meant it, Matthew said, taking a step toward her. I still mean it. I know I broke my promise, but I never broke my love. That never changed, never wavered, never died. Emma looked back and forth between her parents, seeing something in their faces that spoke of a connection deeper than time or distance or pain. Despite her anger, despite her hurt, she could see that they belonged together, that whatever had torn them apart hadn't destroyed what they had built together. What happens now? Emma asked quietly. It was the question they were all thinking, the question that hung over everything like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Matthew had come home, but home was no longer what he had left behind. Sarah Beth had changed, grown strong and independent, learned to rely on herself. Emma was no longer the baby he remembered but a young woman with her own thoughts and feelings and dreams. I don't know, Sarah Beth admitted. I honestly don't know. Matthew moved closer, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of him, leather and soap and something indefinably masculine that belonged only to him. I know I have no right to ask, he said softly, but could you find it in your heart to give me another chance? Not to pick up where we left off, I know that's impossible. But, to start over, to see if we can build something new from what's left of what we had. Sarah Beth looked into his eyes, those blue eyes that had haunted her dreams for 23 years, and saw the boy she had fallen in love with still there beneath the weathered features of the man he had become. She saw regret and hope and love so deep it took her breath away. She also saw Emma watching them both, this daughter who had grown up without her father but who still carried his stubborn chin and his gentle heart. Emma deserved a chance to know her father, to decide for herself whether she could forgive him for the years he had missed. I need time, Sarah Beth said finally. We both need time to think, to figure out what we want, what's possible. You've been gone for 23 years, Matthew. You can't expect us to work through that in one morning. Matthew nodded, understanding and disappointment warring in his expression. Of course. I have a room at the hotel in town. I can wait as long as you need. No, Emma said suddenly, surprising them both. Don't go back to town. Stay here, in the barn. We have a spare room out there, and you can help with the ranch work while Mama decides what she wants to do. Sarah Beth started to protest, but Emma cut her off. I want to get to know my father, she said firmly. I want to hear about where he's been, what he's done, what kind of man he really is. And I want him to know me too. I want him to see what kind of woman his daughter grew up to be. Matthew looked at Sarah Beth with such hope in his eyes that she felt her resolve weakening. If that's what you want, she said slowly, if that's what Emma wants, then yes. You can stay. For now. The smile that spread across Matthew's face was like sunrise after the longest night. Thank you, he said, and she could hear the tears in his voice. Thank you both. As the morning turned toward afternoon, they began the slow, careful process of learning to be a family again. There would be difficult conversations ahead, moments of anger and hurt and disappointment. There would be questions about the future, about whether love could survive so much pain, about whether some wounds were too deep to heal. But, for now, they had taken the first step. They had chosen hope over fear, forgiveness over bitterness, the possibility of healing over the certainty of continued separation. And, in that choice, Sarah Beth began to see the faint outline of a future she had never dared to imagine, a future where the words he had spoken so long ago might finally come true, where forever might still be possible after all. 3 weeks had passed since Matthew Donovan rode back into Sarah Beth's life, and the rhythm of the ranch had begun to change in ways both subtle and profound. The sound of his voice carried across the yard in the early morning as he talked to the horses, gentling them with the same soft words he had once used to calm baby Emma.
His presence filled spaces that had been empty for so long that Sarah Beth had forgotten what it felt like to have help, to have someone share the burden of the endless work that came with running a ranch alone. But the easy part was the work. The hard part was everything else. Sarah Beth stood at her kitchen window, watching Matthew repair a section of fence that had been sagging for months. She had meant to fix it herself, had added it to the long list of tasks that always seemed to grow faster than she could complete them. Now, seeing him work with the sure, steady movements of a man who knew his way around tools and hard labor, she felt a complex mixture of gratitude and resentment that she couldn't quite sort through. He had changed in the years he'd been gone, and not just in the ways that showed on his face. The Matthew she remembered had been gentler, more given to talking through problems than simply solving them with his hands. This Matthew worked with a quiet intensity that spoke of years spent alone, years when the only person he had to please or consider was himself. He was efficient, capable, and utterly self-contained in a way that both impressed and troubled her. "He's different," Emma said, appearing beside her mother at the window. Over the past 3 weeks, Emma had thrown herself into getting to know her father with the single-minded determination she brought to everything that interested her. She followed him around the ranch, asking endless questions about his travels, the places he'd seen, the work he'd done. She was building a picture of the man who had been absent from her life, and Sarah Beth could see her struggling to reconcile the reality with the dreams and fantasies she had carried. "People change," Sarah Beth replied, though she was thinking the same thing. 23 years is a long time to be alone. "Do you still love him?" Emma asked with the directness of youth. Sarah Beth was quiet for a long moment, watching Matthew's shoulders move as he worked, remembering how those same shoulders had sheltered her from winter storms and summer heat, how she had traced the muscles there with her fingers in the darkness of their shared bed. "I never stopped loving the man he was," she said finally. "But I'm not sure yet if I can love the man he's become." It was the truth, though it hurt to admit it even to herself. The Matthew she remembered had been open and expressive, quick to laugh and equally quick to share his thoughts and feelings. This Matthew was quieter, more watchful, with shadows in his eyes that spoke of things seen and done that couldn't be undone. He was kind to her, respectful, helpful in ways that made her daily life easier. But there was a distance between them that felt as vast as the years they had been apart. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah Beth found herself alone with Matthew for the first time since he'd arrived. They sat on the front porch in the gathering dusk, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the soft lowing of cattle in the distance, the rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees by the creek. "You've done a remarkable thing here," Matthew said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Building this place, raising Emma on your own. She's extraordinary, Sarah Beth. Smart and strong and beautiful, just like her mother. She asks about you constantly," Sarah Beth replied. "Wants to know everything about where you've been, what you've done. I think she's trying to fit 23 years of missing you into these few weeks." Matthew nodded slowly. "I know. And I'm trying to give her what she needs, but..." He trailed off, staring out at the darkening landscape. "But?" Sarah Beth prompted. "But I'm not the same man who left here," he admitted. "I've done things, seen things, been places that, well, that aren't fit stories for a young woman to hear. I want to be the father she deserves, but I'm not sure I remember how to be that man." Sarah Beth studied his profile in the fading light, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair. "What kind of things, Matthew? Where have you been all these years?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean closer to hear him. "After I left here, I went north first, up into Montana. Figured I'd find work on a cattle ranch, keep my head down, wait for things to cool down with the Cartwrights. But word traveled fast in those days, and it seemed like everywhere I went, someone had heard about the fight in Murphy's saloon." He paused, and Sarah Beth saw him swallow hard before continuing. "Finally, ended up in the silver mines outside Virginia City. Hard work, dangerous work, but nobody cared who you were or what you'd done as long as you could swing a pick and didn't cause trouble. Spent 3 years underground, saving every penny, thinking I'd come home rich enough to give you everything you'd ever dreamed of." "What happened?" Sarah Beth asked,
though she suspected she already knew.
Mine collapsed, Matthew said simply. Killed 6 men, injured a dozen more. I was lucky to get out alive, but I got out with nothing. Lost everything I'd saved, spent months recovering from a broken back and crushed ribs. By the time I was strong enough to work again, word came that the Cartwrights were still looking for me, still asking questions about a man who matched my description. He stood up abruptly, moving to lean against the porch railing where he could look out at the stars beginning to show in the darkening sky.
After that, I kept moving.
Cattle drives in Texas, logging in Oregon, railroad work in Colorado. Always moving, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or make real friends. Never staying anywhere long enough to matter to anyone. Sarah Beth felt her heart aching for him, for the loneliness and rootlessness that came through in every word. But she also felt a flare of anger at the choices he had made, the way he had let fear keep him from the life they could have built together.
You could have written, she said. You could have let me know you were alive, that you were thinking of us.
Matthew turned to face her, and, in the pale starlight, she could see the pain in his expression. I started 100 letters, he said.
Maybe more. But what was I supposed to say? That I was working in mines and lumber camps, living in bunkhouses with men who didn't know my real name? That I was broke and hurt and so homesick I could barely stand it? That every night I fell asleep thinking about you and every morning I woke up knowing I was no closer to coming home?
You could have said you loved me, Sarah Beth whispered.
You could have said you missed me. You could have said you were trying to find a way back. And give you false hope? Make you wait for a man who might never be able to come home?
Matthew shook his head.
I thought it was kinder to let you believe I was dead.
I thought you'd mourn me and move on, find a good man who could give you the life you deserved. That wasn't your choice to make, Sarah Beth said, standing up to face him. My heart, my life, my future, those were mine to decide about, not yours. You took that choice away from me when you disappeared without a word. They stood facing each other in the darkness, 23 years of hurt and misunderstanding hanging between them like a chasm that might be too wide to bridge. Sarah Beth could feel tears burning her eyes, tears for the young woman she had been, so full of love and hope and trust that the world would treat her gently. I know, Matthew said, and his voice was rough with emotion. I know I took away your choice, and I know that was wrong. I told myself I was protecting you, but maybe I was really just protecting myself from having to face what I'd done, what I'd lost.
Maybe?
Sarah Beth's voice was sharp with pain.
Maybe you were protecting yourself?
Matthew, I spent years wondering if you were alive or dead, if you'd left me by choice or by force. I spent years telling our daughter that her father was a hero who died in an accident, when all the time you were out there somewhere, alive and choosing not to come home. Matthew flinched as if she had struck him, but he didn't defend himself, didn't make excuses.
You're right, he said simply. You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover what I did to you. To both of you. The honesty in his voice, the complete lack of self-justification, took some of the wind out of Sarah Beth's anger. She had expected him to argue, to defend his actions, to try to make her understand why he had felt he had no choice. Instead, he was simply accepting responsibility for the pain he had caused, and somehow that made it harder to hold on to her rage. I kept your letters, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. Matthew looked at her in confusion. What letters? The ones you never sent.
I wrote them in my head, usually late at night when Emma was sleeping and the house was too quiet.
Letters telling me you were safe, that you missed us, that you were working your way back to us.
I kept every imaginary word, and I hated myself for hoping they were real. They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of the years they had spent apart, the different kinds of loneliness they had each endured. Finally, Matthew spoke, his voice so quiet she almost missed the words. I met a woman in Denver, he said. 5 years ago. Her name was Catherine, and she was kind to me.
Patient.
She knew I was running from something, and she didn't push for answers I couldn't give. Sarah Beth felt her stomach drop, though she couldn't have said why the words hit her so hard.
Of course he had met other women.
23 years was a long time to be alone, and Matthew was still an attractive man, still capable of inspiring love in a woman's heart. "Did you love her?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "I tried to," Matthew admitted. "God knows she deserved it. She was good to me, better than I deserved. But every time I looked at her, I saw your face. Every time she spoke, I heard your voice. Every time she touched me, I remembered your hands." He turned to look directly at her, and, in the starlight, she could see the tears on his cheeks. "I couldn't love her because I'd never stopped loving you. And that wasn't fair to her, wasn't fair to either of us. So I left Denver, just like I'd left everywhere else, because I couldn't stay and I couldn't explain why." "You left her too," Sarah Beth said, and there was wonder in her voice. "Just like you left us." "Yes," Matthew said simply. "I left her too. Because leaving was what I knew how to do. It was easier than staying and risking more pain, easier than fighting for something I thought I'd already lost." Sarah Beth felt something shifting inside her, some hard knot of anger and resentment beginning to loosen. She was beginning to understand that Matthew hadn't left because he stopped loving her, hadn't stayed away because he didn't miss them. He had left and stayed away because he was afraid, because he had let fear rule his choices for so long that he had forgotten how to choose love over safety. "Emma wants us to get married again," she said suddenly. Matthew's head snapped up, hope flaring in his eyes before being quickly dampened by caution. "What do you want?" It was the question Sarah Beth had been asking herself for 3 weeks, the question that kept her awake at night and distracted during the day. What did she want? Did she want to risk her heart again with a man who had already broken it once? Did she want to rebuild a life with someone who had spent 23 years learning how to be alone? "I want to trust you," she said finally. "I want to believe that if things got difficult again, you'd stay and fight instead of running away. I want to know that if I let myself love you again, you won't disappear the next time you think leaving would be easier than staying." Matthew stepped closer to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the familiar scent of him that brought back so many memories. "I can't promise that life won't be difficult," he said quietly. "I can't promise there won't be dangers or challenges or reasons to be afraid. But I can promise that I'll never leave you again. I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together." "Those are the same promises you made before," Sarah Beth pointed out. "I was a different man before," Matthew replied. "Younger, more foolish, more certain that I could protect you from everything by taking all the risks on myself. I know better now. I know that love isn't about protecting someone from all pain, it's about being strong enough to face pain together." Sarah Beth looked into his eyes, searching for the truth behind his words. She saw sincerity there, and regret, and love so deep it made her breath catch in her throat. But she also saw something new, something that hadn't been there 23 years ago. She saw a man who had been tested by solitude and hardship and had learned what it meant to lose everything that mattered. "I need more time," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she could feel her resolve weakening. "I have all the time in the world," Matthew said, and this time when he smiled, it was the smile she remembered, warm and patient and full of love. "I spent 23 years without you, Sarah Beth. I can wait however long it takes to convince you to give me another chance." From inside the house came the sound of Emma stirring, probably getting up for a drink of water as she often did in the middle of the night. Soon she would appear on the porch, looking for her parents, eager to continue the slow process of knitting their fractured family back together. "She's determined to make us a family again," Sarah Beth said, nodding toward the house. "She's stubborn like her mother," Matthew replied with gentle humor. "And patient like her father," Sarah Beth added, surprising herself with the admission. They stood together in the darkness, not touching but close enough that Sarah Beth could feel the pull of 23 years of love and longing. She could feel herself balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything, a choice between the safety of the life she had built alone and the risk of loving a man who had already broken her heart once. "Matthew," she said softly, and he turned toward her with such hope in his face that her heart ached with the beauty of it. "Yes?" "Ask me tomorrow," she whispered. "Ask me again tomorrow, and I might give you a different answer." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Tomorrow then," he said. And every day after that until you're ready to say yes. As they stood together beneath the vast Wyoming sky, surrounded by the life Sarah Beth had built and the love that had never truly died, both of them could feel the future stretching out before them like an uncharted trail. There would be more conversations, more questions, more moments of doubt and fear and hope. But, for the first time in 23 years, forever seemed possible again. The words he had spoken so long ago, the promises that had been broken by fear and circumstance, were finding new life in the space between what was lost and what might still be saved. And Sarah Beth Morrison, who remembered every word he had ever spoken to her, was finally ready to believe that some promises, even when broken, could be mended with enough love and patience and time. Some stories, even when interrupted by decades of silence, could find their way to the ending they were always meant to have. Tomorrow, she thought, watching Matthew's face in the starlight. Tomorrow she would say yes to second chances and new beginnings. Tomorrow she would choose love over fear, hope over safety, the uncertain promise of forever over the loneliness of the life she had built without him. Tomorrow, she would remember not just his words, but his presence, his love, and his promise to never leave again.